March 1936. The Krupp factory, Essen, Germany. Adolf Hitler walked through the massive steel foundry with Gustav Krupp, head of one of Germany's most powerful industrial companies. Hitler had a question that had been bothering him for months. What would it take, Hitler asked, to smash through the Maginot Line? The Maginot Line was France's ultimate defense, a 1,500-kilometer wall of concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and fortifications stretching along the French-German border. The bunkers were protected by 7 meters of reinforced concrete. The steel doors were a full meter thick. French military engineers had declared it impenetrable. Gustav Krupp smiled. He'd been waiting for this question. His engineers had already run the calculations, just in case someone asked. The answer was simple, if slightly insane. "We'll build you a gun," Krupp said, "with an 80-centimeter barrel. It will fire 7-ton shells from 30 kilometers away. It will punch through any fortification the French have built." Hitler's eyes lit up. "How long will it take?" "We can have the first one ready by March 1940. What Krupp didn't mention was that this gun would be the largest artillery piece ever built in human history. It would weigh 1,350 tons. It would be 4 stories tall, 140 feet long, and require 500 men just to operate it. It would need to travel on specially built railway tracks because normal tracks would collapse under its weight. And by the time it was finished, it would be completely, utterly useless. But that wouldn't stop Hitler from building it anyway. The Schwerer Gustav, Heavy Gustav, named after Gustav Krupp himself, was an engineering marvel and a strategic disaster rolled into one massive, absurdly expensive package. The barrel alone was nearly 100 feet long. The entire gun had to be disassembled into pieces and transported by train, then reassembled at the firing site by specialized cranes running on additional railway tracks. The ammunition was ridiculous. Each shell weighed either 10,584 pounds for high explosives or 16,540 pounds for concrete piercing rounds. The shells were so large that they required specialized loading equipment and took 45 minutes to load a single round. It took 3,000 pounds of smokeless powder to fire one shot. The explosion created a fireball visible for miles. The recoil was so powerful that the entire 1,350-ton gun rolled backwards several feet on its tracks. And the range? 29 miles. The Gustav could hit targets 29 miles away with reasonable accuracy. Which sounds impressive until you realize that meant the Germans had to build 29 miles of railway track pointing directly at the target. By the time the first Schwerer Gustav was completed in late 1941, the Battle of France was long over. The Maginot Line had never been tested because the German army simply drove around it through Belgium. The strongest fortifications in the world had been defeated not by the world's largest gun, but by a map and some good planning. So now the Germans had a 1,350-ton artillery piece with no targets and nowhere to use it. The gun had cost 10 million Reichsmarks, roughly $50 million in today's money, and it was designed to solve a problem that no longer existed. Someone decided to send it to the Eastern Front. Maybe it would be useful against the Soviets. In February 1942, the Heavy Artillery Unit 672 began the long journey to Crimea, taking the Schwerer Gustav with them. The train carrying the disassembled gun was 25 cars long, 1.5 kilometers of railway cars carrying pieces of the world's largest artillery weapon. It took until early March just to transport it to the Perekop Isthmus. Then the real work began. The Germans had to build a special railway spur line, 16 kilometers long, just to get the gun into position near Sevastopol. At the end of the spur, they constructed 4 semicircular tracks so the gun could be rotated to aim at different targets. They built additional outer tracks for the massive cranes needed to assemble the weapon.
The assembly required 4,000 men and took 5 full weeks. Think about that. 5 weeks. While Soviet defenders were preparing their positions, reinforcing their bunkers, and bringing in reinforcements, 4,000 German soldiers were busy building railway tracks and assembling a giant gun. Finally, on June 5, 1942, the Schwerer Gustav was ready to fire. The targets were impressive: coastal gun batteries, Fort Stalin, Fort Molotov, and most spectacularly, an underground ammunition depot buried roughly 30 meters below sea level in a cliff face, a target everyone said was impossible to hit. The Gustav fired 9 shells at the ammunition depot. One of them found the entrance tunnel and penetrated deep into the cliff before exploding. The resulting secondary explosion from the stored ammunition was so massive that the entire cliff face collapsed. Seismographs recorded the explosion as an earthquake. Soviet defenders who witnessed it were terrified. This was something beyond their experience. Artillery shells weren't supposed to be the size of small cars. Guns weren't supposed to make the ground shake like that. By July 4th, when Sevastopol finally fell, the Schwerer Gustav had fired 47 rounds in combat, and the barrel was completely worn out, useless, shot out. The rifling was gone. It would need to be replaced before the gun could fire again. So let's do the math. The gun had fired about 220 rounds during development and testing, then 47 rounds in combat. That's 267 total shots before the barrel needed replacement. Each shot costs thousands of Reichsmarks in ammunition alone, not counting the 4,000 men for 5 weeks to set it up, or the 500 men required to operate it, or the specialized locomotives and railway cars to transport it. For comparison, a standard German 150mm howitzer could be set up in hours, operated by a crew of 6, fire hundreds of rounds without wearing out, and hit targets 12 miles away. You could build a dozen howitzers for what it cost to transport the Gustav to one firing position. But the Gustav looked impressive. Hitler loved it. Albert Speer loved it. They held a special demonstration in March 1943 where Hitler himself came to watch the gun fire. 2 shots. Everyone clapped. The second shell landed 29 miles away. Propaganda photographs were taken. The gun appeared in newsreels. German civilians saw this mighty weapon and felt confident their military could destroy anything. What the newsreels didn't show was that the gun couldn't hide from aircraft. It couldn't move quickly. It couldn't defend itself. It required perfect weather, perfect logistics, perfect air superiority, and a target that would sit still for 5 weeks while you built railway tracks toward it. The Gustav was eventually dismantled and stored near Chemnitz in September 1943. It sat there until April 14, 1945, when German troops destroyed it to prevent capture by advancing American forces. The second gun, Dora, saw even less action. It was deployed briefly at Stalingrad, arrived too late to matter, and was eventually destroyed by the Germans in April 1945 to prevent capture. All that money, all those resources, all that engineering brilliance, for what? 47 shells fired in anger, 1 ammunition depot destroyed, some fortifications damaged, a few spectacular propaganda photos. The Schwerer Gustav represents everything wrong with Nazi superweapon thinking. Bigger is better. More impressive is more effective. Never mind practicality. Never mind cost. Never mind that you could achieve better results with conventional weapons at a fraction of the expense. The Germans were so busy building the world's largest gun that they forgot to ask whether they actually needed it. French military planners must have laughed when they learned the truth. The Maginot Line, the fortification the Gustav was specifically designed to destroy, was never attacked. The strongest defense in the world defeated by the simple strategy of going around it. And the largest gun in history destroyed by its own creators before it could fall into enemy hands, leaving behind only photographs and stories of what might have been the most expensive, most impractical, most ultimately useless weapon system of World War II. Hitler got his supergun, it just didn't matter.